needs to take a curving path around the screen. And so I'm going to open up the animation day 1 file again, depending on whatever semester you're taking this, it might be something else. All that matters is that you have a symbol to work with. So if we go in the library, we can see that this is the star symbol right here. I can go to properties and it tells me it's a movie clip. As long as it's not just a drawing or a drawn object, we can use this here. The other thing I'm going to do is actually give myself much more room to work with. I could also scale this, but I want to be able to have the vertical room as well. Actually, we're going to even shrink this down further because we need this to kind of fly around the screen. So with pretty much everything we've been doing so far, what we've been doing is we've been expanding out the timeline to a certain extent. We hit F5 or right click insert frame, and then we go somewhere else and we insert keyframe, and then we change one of the keyframes, then we put a tween in. This is very different. This one is backwards from pretty much all of the other procedures because we do still need to make some space in the timeline. We need to, have some time to work with. So you go out to however many frames you think you need and you right click and you say insert frame. And I just paused that real quick to give us a little bigger timeline to work with. And then instead of adding another keyframe, instead of doing that first, we actually add the tween first. So you should only have one keyframe and the rest should be blank frames. And we right click and we say create motion tween. You can see it turns blue. There's no arrows in this one, right? The other tweens had arrows, this one doesn't. And we know this is kind of a different beast because you can see right here that this has, the icon has turned different. You'll remember that happened with masks. And that does happen with a couple of other things. And it means that the animate's trying to tell you that this is a very different idea. Once you turn this layer into a tween, there is no other thing that you're going to do on this layer. It's going to treat everything on the layer like it has to be only one object on the layer. If you had multiple objects, it asks you to combine them. We don't want to do that. But once we have that tween set up, whenever we make a change, it's going to auto key. It's going to automatically put a key in there for us. So if I go to 1 second in and I move this over here, it's going to automatically put this in here. And you'll see that the other thing it's doing is creating a motion path. Now if you're having trouble seeing that motion path, it goes by the color that's assigned to the layer. And we can right click, go to properties, and assign a different color to that layer. So for the purposes of recording my screen, I do tend to stick with these darker colors because it's just easier to see. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can see it. So this motion path shows us how it's going from point A to point B, like along the path. Fun fact, these little dots each equal a frame. So you can kind of tell how fast or slow something's going. The more dots, the slower it's going because the more frames it's taking. But this path is exactly like every other path you've dealt with in here that deals with all the shapes. So if I go into this object right here, you'll remember that, sorry, when you don't have something selected yet and you hover over it and you see that little curve next to the cursor and you click and drag, you can move it. Or if you hover over it and you see that angled thing next to it, you can click and drag an anchor point, right? So one's telling you it's on a curve and it's going to bend the curve, the other's telling you it's on an anchor point and it's going to move the anchor point. You can do that same thing with a motion path. I can, making sure it's not selected because you can select it, I'm going to hover until I see that curve, and now I can put an arc to that motion. I can do the same thing a couple more seconds in. I drag this over here, and at first it wants to curve it into the opposite direction. I can tell it a little bit to curve, but there's a better way to tell it to go in the right direction, right? When you have something very simple, you can just kind of click and drag, curve it around, it's no big deal. Here it's trying to like do the opposite, like the inverse of what I just did, and so it's kind of breaking a little bit. We need to tell this directly what direction to go in. And for that, we use the sub-selection tool, the same tool that you use to draw with, which is why I wanted you all to learn how to draw in here, even if you used Illustrator. I use that and I grab this handle, and that's what curves the line. It's technically what's curving these lines. You just didn't see them before. There's no handle over here. It went for a linear line for whatever reason. So I'm going to hold down Alt, click and drag, and when you see that, you know you're going in the wrong direction, so you click and drag in the opposite direction. There we go. And so now I have this rounded arc. And I can make this however I want. I can also click on one of these anchor points, which is technically a keyframe, and move it. I'm not even on that frame in the timeline, and I'm changing it because it's this one I'm changing. I could change the one that's at the front. Now be careful with this. Don't go adding like anchor points with the pen or things like that, because it won't show up here in your timeline and that becomes very difficult to change the timing. So make sure that if you want to add some kind of anchor point there, you go to that spot in time and you add it. Now you can see it's also kind of messing around with the timing of this a little bit, which is unfortunate. There we go. So there's a little bit of give and take. There's a little bit of, it's like making an assumption of how I want this to ease in and ease out, which kind of sucks. And so I would have to fix that a little bit by changing in, maybe adding an intersecting keyframe, something in the middle. So these two things, now that they're working together, it is hard to keep track of, right? And part of it is also these handles are so much longer, and so there we go. It kind of, you can see everything readjust as soon as I make this handle longer. It readjusts everything. But you can see how now you can get a round path. We couldn't get this before. That was not plausible with the motion path earlier, or with the classic tween. It just wasn't. Right? So now we can get this to move in circles. You can copy and paste sort of frames. It's different commands though. It's not Control-C, Control-V. Do not use that for any timeline stuff whatsoever. It will break. Go to the frame you want to go on and make sure the whole timeline is not selected. This happens sometimes where people do stuff and I'm trying to, there we go. The whole thing gets selected and they make a change and it kind of like messes with things. Make sure you kind of click off somewhere and then click and have only one frame selected. And then you right click and ignore all this copy frame stuff. This doesn't apply here. Go to copy properties. And then I go to where I want to go, back to that point in time, and I right click and I say paste properties. When I do that, it brings it there. And now once again, I do have to mess with the timeline a little bit. I do have to, there we go. It doesn't do the same motion path, it just puts it to the same location. But it messes with how it does that. There we go. But now this and this frame will be the same because I copied the properties. How they get there will be different. They are coming from different places. Now it kind of landed really hard too, which is unfortunate. Another thing to keep in mind is that this can track keys for lots of different stuff. So I can go here and I can say, oh, I want the scale to be larger. And so it will get bigger as it's going. But now here's the problem. The first key automatically keys everything. It keys, you can actually look at the list, right click, view keyframes, position, scale, skew, rotation, color, filter. All of those things get keyed automatically on the first one. But if I go to this one and I right click and I say view keyframes, it will only have the only ones it's considered so far are the ones you changed, which is position and scale, which means this had no scale keyframe on it. which means it starts growing from there and gets bigger until here, and then the rest of them, it doesn't stay smaller either. So if you want this to, work our way backwards. Okay. If you want this to get bigger just from here to here and then get smaller again, the first thing we have to do is go to the surrounding keyframes and say right click, insert keyframe, scale. I have to say I want it to be this size on that keyframe, and I want it to be that size, insert keyframe, scale, here. And then I can go here and change this. And now it will stay the same size until I get to that second keyframe, gets bigger, and then gets smaller again. Right? So you have to make sure you're manually placing keyframes in these various locations. Rotation is also a bit of a bug. And this is true, this is always true for this program. Rotation always sucks. If I, let's see, come on, there you go. I'm going to go to that keyframe, I'm going to say insert keyframe, rotation. And then I'm going to go to the end and say I want it to rotate a bit. It will oblige. I can see it rotating a little bit to get to there, so that's fine. But if you try to do, there we go. I might have undone too far. So if I do insert keyframe rotation here, and then I spin it, it's a little hard with a star, but more than 180 degrees, what it's going to do, oh, that time it listened to me. So sometimes it is still rotating in the correct direction, but if you over rotate it, if you do like more than 180 or more than 360, it'll get confused and it might turn in the opposite direction because that's the shorter direction. The other thing that can happen is nope. Let's see. Okay, it's gone. You can spin something the whole time. This tween does have properties. And so you can say rotate 2 times. Counterclockwise? Yeah, I think that's what I want. And I can watch that. It's a little bit tricky because it's spinning while it's rotating, so it looks funny. But it is doing that. You cannot turn this on and off, though. The whole tween has to be doing that the whole time. Now, you can have 2 different versions of the star. One where it goes to here and it's not spinning, and then one where spinning the rest of the time if you just have 2 different layers. So if we unspin this for a second, you can always duplicate a layer. And then we can tell the non-spinning layer to remove frames from the second half. And we tell the spinning layer to remove frames from the first half. Now the trick is you then have to take this second half animation, select it, and drag it out so that these keyframes line up. And now right now, it doesn't, you can't tell that you're switching between layers because they're identical. These are identical animations with identical symbols, so you can't tell that they're changing, which means you can now take this one and say rotate once counterclockwise. And it should start spinning at that point. Now keep in mind, once you split this, you can't make any other changes without messing it up. You can't change where this keyframe is, its location. There's no way you're going to make them both match again, unless you maybe copy properties, but even then your paths might not match up very well, so you kind of have to like have everything else down and then split the layer like that to get that animation. But it's necessary sometimes if you want to have different properties moving differently. There is this ease thing right here, and it's a lot like the classic tween, except it's across the whole thing, again like rotation. So there is a way to get in here. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But I don't usually use this ease because it's across multiple keyframes. I'm never going to have something that eases into that whole thing. That's not how animation works. It speeds up and then slows down. It speeds up and whatever it's doing. So the things to consider, I wouldn't use that. I'm going to undo this back to it being one layer because I need to be able to change things. Another thing that we can do, I'm going to squash this. What I can do is I can actually drag select this. I can go clear keyframe scale because I want to make sure there's no scale keyframes anywhere. Because I'm going to squash it. Mostly because I just want it pointing in a particular direction. As you can imagine, if you have something where direction matters and you want it pointed along the path, how do we do that? Well, you don't have to do it manually. The only thing you have to do is go to the first frame, point it in the initial direction, click on the tween to get the settings, and say orient to path. Now, if you do this, you're not rotating it. That's not an option. But what it'll do, you can see it, right? It's pointed along the path in the direction that it's going, and the computer's doing that for you. You don't have to manually do that. That's the good news. The bad news is that in order for this program to figure out how to do that, it's going to put a keyframe on every frame. So if you are going to do that and then decide to make changes, you have to turn this off. It's like turning off the mask to edit it. You turn that off and then you say, okay, I want this to be over here, and I want this to be over here. And you can see it looks kind of dumb because it's, it's not going in the right direction. And where's this thing here? I want it to be on screen more. Right? So we can, there we are. There's things we can do to change the animation, and then we go back. I tend to go back to the beginning, make sure it's still lining up. It's not, because I changed the path, so I got to realign it, and then click on the motion tween, say orient to path. It always orients it based on the first frame. So as long as you've got that lined up, you can be at any point in the timeline and turn this back on. And now it'll follow the new animation. Alright, so that's it for these settings over here. There is one last place of settings, and it's not easy to deal with. I said before that this ease doesn't really work very well. It's an understatement. What we need to do is we need to change eases within here. There is only one way to do that. We double click this and we get a graph. And this is something that you just have to get used to. And it's just going to be weird. And it's also going to help me with this stupid, all the frames are like skipping and it's going really fast right here and here nonsense. And it's called a graph editor. At least in most programs, it's called a graph editor. And it's showing the X and Y. You can see the problem right there. That's this. But it's the speed. So you can see it's slowing down a little and then speeding up and speeding up faster and then slowing down. And I'm not sure why it's decided to do that. I did not put any, well, okay, no. Part of it is that if it's moving consistently, it's not moving consistently over X and Y, but still. And you can see when I click that, it resets a little bit of this. So the Y, when you get this, that steep of a curve, it's sort of like an unsolvable thing in algebra, and it just stinks. We don't like it. So we're gonna, you can go in here, and just like all the other paths in your life in this program, you can kind of smooth them out a little bit. Now sometimes they are going to be very pointed. For example, you can see this is radically changing direction along the X. It stops here, and then it goes here. So of course this is going to be a little bit bent. But what you saw before, this is broken. That usually should not look like that. So we go in here and we kind of change these things. But the other thing you can do is know that the higher up this is on the graph, the faster it's going. And the steeper it is, the more fast the speed is changing. So for example, if for this first segment I want it to start slow and then speed up, I can, for both the X and the Y graph, and you kind of got to do this gradually and figure it out, I can start slow. Oh no, not negative numbers. We don't want to go below 0. No, no, no. I can start slow and I can move this up for Y for x is already, oh, my apologies, I did that incorrectly. Different graph editors work a little bit differently. I misstated what the graph is saying. It's the steepness of the graph that's how fast it's going. This is simply where it is. So the fact that this is really steep is why it's changing too quickly, and when I make it more shallow, my apologies. So now what we have to do is I have to make this graph shallow in the first place and then steep. So it's actually almost going backwards, I think. Oh yeah, this is the y. Mostly we're moving along the x, so I'm going to start there, right? That's the more direct route, and I'm going to pull this handle down. And what that will do is, you can see it gets flatter here and then steeper there. And you can see this, there's more dots here now, and there's fewer dots here. And the more I expand this out, the flatter I make this graph here, the steeper it gets over here. I've also seemed to have broken it to the point where it's not going to tell me what my frames are doing anymore. But it is going the speed I want it to. See how the dots disappeared? That can kind of happen sometimes. But if I watch it, it's slow and then it's fast. And that's exactly what I wanted. I double click to go back in, and I want it to go at a very linear speed for this section. It's tricky because these are tangents. So this, there we go. I moved this and the other side moved, and that's no good, right? And you also have to deal with the fact that there's different ones are changing differently. There we go. So I want this to be an even graph as much as possible. Right? X and Y are talking to each other, so it's a little bit of a, oh, see, I broke it. It took away the curve, basically. So you kind of have to just get a hang of how this thing thinks, which is always tricky, and never straightforward, unfortunately. But it can be done. There we go. I can see them evening out, kind of. And now when I watch it, it's going to speed up, and it goes the same speed there. And then maybe I want it to slow down at the end. If I want it to slow down at the end, I drag this out to make the arc flat, and I drag that to make it steep. But you can see that is breaking. Yes, that's doing what I want it to. Slow, fast, even speed, faster, slowing down is what we're looking at, generally speaking. Again, you have to keep watching the animation to make sure it is doing what you want, and you have to keep looking at your curve to make sure it's not changing where it goes. That looks stupid with it squashed, but that is how you have to change the timing. So there is an upside to motion tween. You get such control over where it's going, but in order to control the timing, it's a lot more difficult. You have to deal with the graph editor, and that just takes time and practice. And you can see even I'm adding in extra kinks accidentally, and I got to go in and fix it a little bit. This does take a lot of give and take. It takes a lot of redoing. It takes a lot of making sure you save in case you break it and can go back to the old one. So tread with caution with this. Definitely experiment on stuff that doesn't matter to you as much, and then see how well you can get it to work.